Welcome to Extended Families of Nebraska, Maltreatment, Abuse, Neglect, and Exploitation Training. Treating people with dignity and respect requires they are free from abuse and neglect. As employees and subcontractors of Extended Families of Nebraska, you are required to comply with the Nebraska law regarding the reporting of abuse and neglect of vulnerable people. This training was developed to meet the training requirements to identify, respond, and report witnessed or suspected incidents of abuse and neglect. The first step in identifying and reporting abuse and neglect is to define what abuse and neglect is. In this training, we will look at the 4 areas of abuse and neglect: maltreatment, abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Maltreatment is defined as treating another person badly or abusively in a rough or cruel way. Abuse is an act of aggression by one person intended to inflict harm on another person. Abuse can be when one person tries to or does hurt or harm another person on purpose. Neglect is an act of omission by any person that results in the harm of another person. Neglect can be when one person doesn't give a person with a disability the kind of support they have promised, and this results in the person getting sick or hurt. And exploitation. This is when one person uses another person for financial gain. Exploitation happens when one person takes advantage of another person. Abuse and neglect can happen to anyone, regardless of race, age, gender, religion, or sexuality. Yet some groups of people are uniquely vulnerable to abuse. In particular, people with disabilities are more likely to experience violence than people without disabilities. People with disabilities make up a fraction of the population, yet they are 2 to 3 times more likely to experience abuse or neglect in comparison to those without disabilities. There are several reasons why people with disabilities are more vulnerable to abuse and neglect. A few of them include: persons with physical disabilities may depend on others to meet some of their basic needs. Care providers may be involved in the most intimate and personal parts of an individual's life, which may increase the opportunity for abusive acts. Persons with intellectual disabilities may be overly trusting of others and easier to trick, bribe, or coerce. They may not understand the differences between sexual and non-sexual touches, and persons with cognitive disabilities who are abused may not understand the violation is not normal, especially in the case of sexual abuse. Persons with speech impairments may have limited vocabulary or communication skills that can pose as barriers to disclosing abuse. Many people with disabilities have been taught to be obedient, passive, and to control difficult behaviors. This compliance training teaches them to be good victims for abuse. Many persons with disabilities grow up without receiving sexual education, abuse prevention information, or self-defense training. They may lack knowledge about their bodies, healthy relationships, and how to protect themselves. A person who has a mental illness may be vulnerable to victimization if they have difficulty discerning between reality and fantasy, and/or are dependent on others for care. People with disabilities may be perceived by offenders as easy targets, and society in general tends to view people with disabilities as non-sexual, lacking intelligence, and not credible witnesses. While people with disabilities are more vulnerable to abuse and neglect, they also experience barriers to reporting abuse and neglect. These barriers can include fear, isolation, and credibility issues. Fear: the person may be unable to escape the abuser's control. The abuser may be threatening to withdraw services or hurt the person's family members or friends. Isolation: some people with disabilities have had little or no contact with anyone other than their caregivers. They may not have had people to act as advocates on their behalf. And credibility issues: people with disabilities are often considered to be less credible. For example, they may be seen as unreliable witnesses or exaggerating events. There are 5 types of abuse which can occur. We are going to define and provide examples of each of the 5 types of abuse. The 5 types of abuse include physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Physical abuse is generally characterized by physical injury such as bruising and fractures. Examples of physical abuse include, but are not limited to, punching, beating, kicking, shaking, grabbing, throwing, stabbing, choking, burning, hitting with a hand, stick, or strap, or other object. Although an injury resulting from physical abuse is not accidental, the caregiver may not have intended to hurt the individual, but injury may be the result of a single episode or of repeated episodes and can range in severity from minor marks and bruising to death. Sexual abuse generally refers to sexual acts, sexually motivated behaviors involving individuals, or sexual exploitation of individuals. Examples of abuse include oral, anal, genital, penile, or digital penetration, genital contact with no penetration, fondling of breasts or buttocks, indecent exposure, inadequate or inappropriate supervision of sexual activities, the use of prostitution, pornography, or other sexually exploitative activities. Sexual abuse includes both touching offenses and non-touching offenses and can involve varying degrees of violence and emotional trauma. Psychological abuse, known as emotional abuse and neglect, refers to a repeated pattern of caregivers' behavior or extreme incidents that convey to an individual they are worthless, flawed, unloved, unwanted, endangered, or only of value in meeting another's needs. Examples of psychological abuse can include belittling or ridiculing an individual, threatening violence against an individual or threatening to place the individual in a dangerous situation. Isolation, confining an individual, or placing unreasonable limitations to freedom of movement or restricting social interactions, or denying emotional responsiveness. Failure to provide or allow treatment for mental health or medical problems. Psychological abuse is a way to control another by using emotions to criticize, embarrass, shame, blame, or manipulate another person. When emotional abuse is severe and ongoing, a victim may lose their entire sense of self, sometimes without a single mark or bruise. Instead, the trauma is invisible to others. Neglect is generally characterized by omissions in care resulting in significant harm or risk of significant harm. Neglect is frequently defined in terms of failure to provide basic needs, deprivation of adequate food, clothing, shelter, supervision, or medical care. Neglect laws often exclude circumstances in which an individual's needs are not met because of poverty or an inability to provide. Examples include a refusal to allow health care, failure to provide care needed or recommended by a healthcare professional, delays in health care, failure to seek timely, appropriate medical care for a serious health problem that any reasonable person would have recognized as needing professional medical attention, abandonment, the desertion of an individual without arranging for reasonable care or supervision, and other physical neglect, such as not providing adequate nutrition, clothing, or hygiene, inattention to avoidable hazards in the home, and other forms of reckless disregard of an individual's safety or welfare. There are many different types of neglect, but they all have consequences, whether it be physically or mentally. Neglect can affect the body physically by affecting an individual's health, leading to chronic medical problems. Not only is neglect associated with physical problems, it also has an effect on a person's mental well-being. Exploitation is when a person utilizes money or assets that do not belong to them or for their personal gain. Examples include forcing an individual to give you access to their assets or finances, forcing an individual to sell or give away their property, using an individual's money to make purchases for yourself, or purchasing possessions from an individual at a reduced price, or encouraging them to sell you something cheaper than fair value. Exploitation can happen with the individual's knowledge and permission if they don't understand what is being agreed to. There are many signs that physical abuse can be occurring. If you notice an unexplained injury or complaint of pain on an individual you work with, it is best practice to follow up to determine the cause of any of these injuries. Any injury noticed should be documented and reported to your coordinator. Just as there are signs of physical abuse, there are signs of emotional or psychological abuse that may be occurring as well. It is important to make note of any ongoing changes of a person's behavioral pattern and report any ongoing challenging behaviors or changes in behavior to your coordinator. There are also many indications that neglect may be occurring. While neglect is generally not intentional, if you notice any of these signs on an individual or in the individual's environment, it is important to report these concerns to your coordinator. Any person who observes abuse or neglect or has reasonable cause to believe that it has occurred must either report or cause a report to be made to the Nebraska Office of Adult Protective Services or Child Protective Services. Reporting may be done by any extended families of Nebraska employee, subcontractor, or their supervisor. If an employee makes any direct report to an outside agency, the employee or subcontractor must also notify a coordinator within Extended Families of Nebraska. Knowledge of abuse that is not reported is a criminal offense according to Nebraska statute. If a person is in immediate danger, law enforcement contact should be contacted immediately. When reporting incidents of Maine, all incidents of suspected or witnessed abuse or neglect should be immediately reported to the employee or subcontractor's coordinator and/or quality improvement coordinator. If a reporter is unable to contact these individuals or they are under suspicion, the executive director should be contacted. Mandated reporters have the option of reporting instances of suspected abuse or neglect directly to law enforcement or protective services. Mandated reporters who opt to report directly to law enforcement or protective services are responsible for ensuring the report reaches the appropriate investigative authorities. As an employee or subcontractor of Extended Families of Nebraska, you are a mandated reporter of all incidences or suspicion of abuse and neglect. Now that you have completed the maltreatment, abuse, neglect, and exploitation training, the final step is to complete the online test. Please click on the link located below in the description section to complete the test. You must receive an 80% to pass. Upon completion, you will be notified if you do not pass and contacted by your coordinator for additional training instructions.